Sometimes I forget you grew up sleeping on other people's couches, Beau. It's remarkable, really, how well you've learned to hold a wine glass. The words landed like a slap dressed up in silk. Vivienne Ashford said them lightly, almost affectionately, the way a woman might tease a man she loved, except her eyes did not smile, and the table beside them had gone quiet enough to hear it. Beau Landry did not flinch outwardly. 22 years of practice had taught him how to keep his face still, even when something inside him folded in on itself. But the sentence found the oldest wound he owned, and pressed against it, patient and precise, the way only someone who truly knew where to aim ever could. The restaurant sat along the curve of the Mississippi, its windows framing the slow brown water, and the lights of the barges drifting past like sleepy fireflies. Crystal chandeliers threw gold across white tablecloths. A pianist somewhere near the bar played something low and unhurried. This was Beau's restaurant, one of 11 now carrying the Landry name across the South. And yet in this moment, surrounded by his own success, he felt 8 years old again, standing barefoot on a cracked kitchen floor while his stomach folded around nothing. He set down his fork very carefully, the way a man sets down something he does not trust his hand not to break. "I remember where I came from," Beau said quietly. "I don't need reminding." Vivienne smiled the smile she wore for photographers. "I'm not reminding you, darling. I'm complimenting you. Self-made men are so fashionable this decade." She lifted her glass toward the light, admiring the way the wine caught it already, moving on to the next thought, already certain the conversation had cost her nothing. "Welcome to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. Before we begin, we would love to know where you are watching this video from. What time is it where you are right now, and which country are you joining us from? Is it the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, or somewhere else in the world? Please leave a comment and share it with us. It would be truly wonderful if people from all around the world could connect with one another, share their stories and feelings, and spread kindness and love through every video. Thank you for becoming a part of our community. We hope you enjoy a meaningful, peaceful, and heartwarming time watching this video." Beau looked past her toward the window, toward the river he had once stared at from underneath, an overpass, wondering if the water ever got tired of moving. He had been 11 that winter. His mother had been gone 5 years by then. Dead, he'd always been told, though. Something about the phrase had never sat easily in his chest, and his father worked nights that stretched longer than the boy could measure, leaving Beau to learn certain lessons on his own. Lessons about hunger that did not politely wait its turn. Lessons about cold that found its way through cardboard and blanket alike, through the thin walls of the room above Delacroix's laundromat, where they'd lived for 2 winters before the money ran out even for that. He remembered counting ceiling cracks to keep from counting the hours until his father came home. He remembered the particular shame of a school lunch line, teachers who looked at him with pity that felt worse than the hunger itself. He had built an empire in part so that no one would ever look at him that way again. And yet here he sat in a restaurant that bore his name, being reminded by the woman he was set to marry that his origins were a curiosity, a party trick, a thing to be complimented rather than understood. "You didn't have to say it like that," Beau said. "I said it exactly how I meant it." Vivienne's tone sharpened just slightly, the polish cracking at the edges, the way it sometimes did when she believed no one important enough was listening. "Honestly, Beau, some nights I think you enjoy being the boy from the laundromat more than you enjoy being the man who owns half the restaurants in Louisiana." He did not answer. There was no answer that would satisfy her, and he had learned across 3 years together that some silences were kinder than words. He reached instead for his water glass, grounding himself in the small, ordinary motion, the way he had once grounded himself as a boy, by counting his own footsteps on cold pavement, 1, 2, 3, anything to keep from falling into the panic that waited just beneath. That was when he smelled it. A perfume, warm and faintly floral, cutting through the restaurant's practiced scent of butter and cedar and candle smoke. It should have meant nothing. Perfume was perfume, but something in Beau's chest seized before his mind had even finished the thought. Some old animal instinct recognizing a sound before the ear could name it. He turned his head slowly, almost against his own will, the way a man turns toward a memory he has spent 8 months trying not to have. She was standing 3 tables away, balancing a tray against one hip, the curve of her belly unmistakable beneath the black apron of the waitstaff. Her hair was pulled back the way it had been that night, loose strands escaping at her temple. Her face, when it turned and found his, went the color of paper. Grace. The room did not stop exactly. The pianist kept playing, a waiter kept pouring, Vivienne kept talking about something Beau no longer heard, but for Beau everything narrowed to the space between his table and hers, 8 months collapsing into 8 seconds. He remembered the sound of her laugh in a dim French quarter bar, unguarded and real, in a way nothing in his life had been in years. He remembered leaving before dawn the folded note, the phone number written twice in case the ink smeared. He remembered searching afterward, quietly, carefully, in the only way a man in his position could search without drawing attention, and finding nothing until he had told himself with the particular cruelty men use on themselves that she must have simply chosen to disappear. She had not disappeared. She was standing 8 feet away from him carrying his child. His hand tightened around the water glass hard enough that Vivienne finally noticed breaking off mid-sentence to follow his gaze. "Beau, what is it?" He did not answer her. He could not in that moment have produced a single word in the English language, because every part of him, the boy who had once stood hungry in a cold hallway, and the man who now owned the room they sat in, had gone completely helplessly. Still, Grace's eyes held his for one long, unbearable moment. He watched something move across her face, not the shy shock of a stranger, but the specific private terror of someone who has spent 8 months preparing every possible version of this encounter, and finding now that it had arrived, none of her preparations had been enough. Her free hand drifted almost without her permission to rest beneath the curve of her belly, as though she could shield the child inside her from a room that had suddenly turned its full attention toward them both. Then with visible effort she looked away. She adjusted the tray on her hip, straightened her spine the way a woman does when she has learned the hard way, that composure is sometimes the only armor available, and continued walking toward the kitchen as though the last 8 seconds had not just rearranged the architecture of Beau Landry's entire life. He rose halfway out of his chair before he understood what he was doing, then caught himself aware of Vivienne's eyes on him, aware of the maitre d' watching from across the room, aware that whatever this was, it could not unfold. Here, in front of strangers, in front of the woman he was supposed to marry in the spring. Beau. Vivienne's voice had lost its silk now. It had gone flat and cold. "Do you know that woman?" He sat back down slowly. Somewhere beneath the table his hands had begun very faintly to shake the same tremor he remembered from childhood, the one that used to come after too many hours without food, except this time hunger had nothing to do with it. He thought of the note he had left on a hotel nightstand 8 months ago, the number he had written twice for certainty, and the silence that had followed it for 8 long months. He thought of the boy who had once believed his mother simply vanished, and the man who had spent his whole life afraid that everyone he loved eventually did the same. "I don't know," Beau said finally, and the words came out rougher than he intended, half confession, half warning to himself. "I thought I did. A long time ago." Vivienne opened her mouth to press further, but Beau was no longer listening. His eyes had already found the swinging kitchen door through which Grace had disappeared, and something in his chest, old buried, carefully guarded for 28 years, had begun quietly, and without his permission, to come apart. 8 months earlier, on a night thick with the smell of river damp and fried oysters, Beau Landry had walked into a bar on a narrow street off Bourbon without a driver, without a bodyguard, without the name that usually walked into rooms. Before he did, he had told his security team he wanted an hour alone. It was not the first time he had asked for that hour, and it would not be the last. But that particular evening carried a weight he had not been able to name, the kind of restlessness that settled into a man's chest on the anniversary of things he tried very hard not to count. The bar was small and unglamorous, lit by strings of bulbs that buzzed faintly overhead its floor, sticky in places with decades of spilled drinks nobody had ever quite managed to scrub away. A trumpet player worked through something slow near the back window. Beau took a stool at the end of the counter, ordered a whiskey he did not intend to finish, and let himself for 1 hour be nobody in particular. That was when he saw her. She sat 2 stools down, her shoulders drawn in on themselves the particular way a person's shoulders draw in when they are trying to take up less space than their pain is asking for. Her makeup was simple, her earrings small and plain, and there was a fragile brightness to her smile that did not reach her eyes. A smile Beau recognized instantly because he had worn one exactly like it more times in his life than he could count. She was turning a glass of house wine slowly on its coaster, not drinking it, just watching the light move through it. Something about her stillness pulled at him. In a room full of people trying to be noticed, she seemed to be trying very hard not to be. "Rough night?" Beau asked, before he had decided to speak at all. Grace Sinclair glanced up, startled, then managed a small, tired laugh. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's had a few of his own." She studied him for a moment. Not the practiced, appraising look he was used to from women who recognized his face from magazine covers, but something more curious, more human. Whatever she saw in him seemed to satisfy her enough to answer honestly. "I lost my job 3 days ago. My rent's due next week. My mother needs medicine I can't quite afford yet, and my roommate finally got tired of watching me cry into my cereal and dragged me out of the apartment so I'd stop doing it alone." She shook her head, embarrassed. "You didn't ask for my whole resume of bad luck. Sorry. I asked last, Beau said quietly. I don't mind the answer. They talked for nearly 2 hours after that, though neither of them could have said later exactly how the time had passed. Beau did not tell her about the 11 restaurants that carried his family name, or the tower downtown, with his initials carved discreetly into the lobby floor, or the other quieter title that came with obligations he rarely let himself think about even in daylight. He told her his first name, and let that be enough. In exchange, she gave him something far more valuable than her own name. She gave him the truth unguarded. The way people speak only when they believe there is nothing left to lose by being honest. She told him about her mother's illness, the medication that cost more some months than Grace made in 2 weeks of waiting tables. She told him about the dream she carried quietly, almost apologetically, of one day opening a small catering business of her own, something modest, something hers. She told him, laughing at herself, even as her eyes went bright with unshed tears, that she had started talking to her houseplants because at least they didn't ask her how the job search was going. Beau listened the way he had not listened to anyone in years. There was no calculation behind her words, no awareness of what his attention might be worth, no angle to protect. For a man who had spent 2 decades in rooms where every sentence carried a price, her honesty landed like something almost physically warm. You're not what I expected when you sat down. Grace admitted somewhere near midnight. What did you expect? I don't know. Someone who talks more about himself. She tilted her head, studying him again. You listen like you're memorizing something. Beau almost told her the truth then, that he was memorizing something that he had spent so many years being listened to for what he could offer. That he had forgotten what it felt like to be listened to simply because a stranger wanted to know him. Instead, he said, Maybe I just don't have much interesting to say about myself tonight. She didn't believe him, he could tell, but she let it go, and something about her willingness to let it go, to accept the parts of him that stayed folded shut without demanding he unfold them, undid something in his chest that had been wound tight for longer than he could remember. Later, when the trumpet player packed up his case and the bartender began flipping chairs onto tables, they walked out into the wet, close night together, neither of them quite ready to end it. Neither of them planned what came after. There was no calculation in it, no promise exchanged. Only 2 exhausted people who had found briefly and by accident a version of peace they had both been missing for a very long time. Beau did not tell her that night about the boy who had once slept above a laundromat with cardboard stuffed against a window that would not close. He did not tell her about counting ceiling cracks in the dark, or about a mother he had been told was dead, and had never quite let himself grieve properly, because grief for a child with no one to hold him through, it is a luxury that has to wait. He did not tell her about the empire he had built out of that hunger, brick by brick, restaurant by restaurant. As if enough success might one day fill a hole that had opened in him decades ago, and never fully closed. He did not need to tell her any of it. For a handful of hours in a city that never quite slept, Grace Sinclair had already reached the part of him none of that history could touch, not because she knew what he carried, but because without knowing she had been gentle with it. Anyway, they left the bar sometime after midnight, walking without direction through streets slick with humidity past shuttered shop fronts, and the low murmur of jazz drifting from somewhere out of sight. Neither of them spoke of tomorrow. Neither of them asked the other's last name. For that single night, Beau Landry was not a billionaire, not the quiet head of an organization his father had built in shadow, not a man engaged to a woman who understood the value of his name better than the shape of his heart. He was simply a man who had been listened to, and who for the first time in longer than he could remember had listened back. It would be many hours before morning came, and with it an urgent phone call that would tear him from that room, before either of them woke. The first thread pulled from a night that neither of them yet understood would unravel into 8 months of silent searching and grief. Neither one of them had asked for. But in the hours before that call arrived, there was only the 2 of them, unguarded, unnamed, and for reasons neither could have explained, entirely certain that something rare had just found them both. The phone rang at an hour when the French Quarter had finally gone quiet, when even the trumpet players had folded their cases and gone home, when the only sound left on the street below was the occasional hiss of a delivery truck easing over wet cobblestones. Beau Landry woke to it the way a man wakes, when some old buried part of him has been waiting for bad news his entire life, instantly, completely. His heart already pounding before his mind caught up to the reason why. Grace stirred beside him, still half inside a sleep that had come easily for the first time in weeks. Beau eased himself away from her with a care that surprised him, careful not to wake her, careful not to let the mattress shift too suddenly, as though some part of him already understood that whatever waited on the other end of that call was about to take something from this room he would not get back. Mr. Landry. His head of security, Marcus Doucet, kept his voice low and clipped the voice of a man delivering news he had rehearsed on the way to making the call. "It's your father. He collapsed at the house about 20 minutes ago. The paramedics are taking him to Oxnard now." "It doesn't look good, sir." Beau did not remember standing. He did not remember crossing the small room, pulling on yesterday's shirt with hands that had begun faintly to shake an old tremor, one that belonged to a boy who used to lie awake, counting his father's footsteps on the stairs, praying they would keep coming. Cormac Landry had never been a soft man. He had never once told his son he loved him in words either of them could remember afterward. But he was the only parent Beau had left, the last living thread to a childhood that had cost them both more than either had ever said aloud, and the thought of losing him in a hospital hallway alone without his son beside him was more than Beau's chest could hold steady. He looked back at Grace asleep, in the gray pre-dawn light, one arm curled beneath the pillow, her face softer than he imagined his own had looked in years. He wanted more than he had wanted almost anything in recent memory to sit down on the edge of that bed and simply watch her breathe for another minute. There was no time for that luxury. There was rarely time in Beau's life for the things he actually wanted. He found a hotel notepad in the drawer of the nightstand, the kind printed with the establishment's small gold crest, and he wrote quickly, his hand less steady than he would have liked. "Grace, my father's been taken to the hospital. I have to go. I didn't want to wake you, but I didn't want you to think I just left either. Call me. Please. 504-555-0148. I mean that twice in case the ink runs. Call me." He read it once, decided it said enough of what could not wait to be said properly, and set it on the nightstand where she would see it the moment she opened her eyes. He weighed leaving more an explanation of who he was, why a man in a rumpled shirt at 4 a.m. had a driver waiting downstairs, and decided against it. That conversation deserved daylight and her full attention and the kind of honesty a folded note could not carry. He would tell her everything. He would call the front desk from the car and ask them gently not to disturb the room until she woke on her own. He bent down, brushed a strand of hair from her temple, and left before he could change his mind about any of it. The hospital corridor smelled the way. Hospital corridors always smelled of antiseptic and fear disguised as calm. And Beau spent the better part of 4 hours in a plastic chair, too small for a man his size, watching doctors move in and out of his father's room with expressions that gave nothing away. Cormac had suffered what the doctors called a cardiac event. Serious, survivable, but serious enough that the word nearly kept attaching itself to every sentence spoken in that hallway. Beau called the front desk of the hotel twice that morning, as promised, each time asking the same quiet question, each time told the same thing. The room had not been disturbed per his instructions, and no calls had come through for a Miss Sinclair. He did not yet know that somewhere between his leaving and the housekeeping staff's early rotation, a young woman named Odette, new to the job, eager to impress a floor supervisor who valued speed over care, had entered the room an hour ahead of the do not disturb notice, believing it had already expired. She had gathered the glasses from the nightstand, swept the crumpled napkins and empty coffee cups into a bin, and without a second glance, cleared the small stack of hotel stationery, along with them the notepad, the pen, and the single folded sheet that had taken Beau 3 attempts to word correctly. It would be many months and much heartbreak before anyone understood exactly how much that ordinary, careless moment would cost. When Grace woke, sunlight had already climbed halfway up the curtains, and the room was silent in a way that felt wrong before she had even opened her eyes fully. She reached across the bed and found it cold. She sat up, blinking, waiting for the sound of a shower, running footsteps in the hallway, anything, and found only the hum of the air conditioner and the distant murmur of the street below. Beau. Her voice sounded small in the empty room, smaller than she wanted it to. She checked the bathroom. She checked the small sitting area by the window. She opened the door and looked down the corridor in both directions, feeling with each step a version of dread she recognized from other mornings in her life. Mornings when people she needed had simply not been there when she woke, and she had learned slowly and painfully not to expect otherwise. There was no note on the nightstand. There was no note anywhere. The room had been cleaned so thoroughly that even the small trace of him, a glass with his fingerprints, a jacket thrown over a chair, had vanished along with everything else. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, one hand pressed flat against the frame, trying to convince herself that a man who did not even know her last name owed her nothing. That this was simply how these nights sometimes ended. That she had known that going in. It did not stop the hollow feeling that settled into her chest and stayed there for the rest of the day. She did not know his last name. She did not know where he worked or lived or which hospital, if any, had called him away in the night. She knew only a first name, the particular sound of his laugh, and the memory of being listened to so completely that for a handful of hours she had almost let herself believe good things still happened to people like her. By the time she left the hotel that afternoon quietly before the front desk could ask questions, she had no good answers, for she had already begun the long private work of convincing herself that none of it had meant what it felt like it meant. She did not yet know she was carrying proof that it had. 3 weeks after the morning she woke alone in a hotel room, stripped clean of any trace of him. Grace Sinclair sat on the edge of a bathtub in her small apartment on Dauphine Street, staring at a test strip she had bought at a pharmacy 2 blocks away in a checkout line where she'd prayed, absurdly, that the cashier wouldn't recognize her. She had told herself in the days leading up to that moment that the nausea was stress. She had told herself the same thing so many times that saying it out loud to her roommate, Dana Whitmore, had started to feel like a superstition, as though repeating the lie enough times might make it true. But her body had already begun keeping a truth. Her mind wasn't ready to hold, and when the second pink line appeared faint and then undeniable, Grace found she could not cry. She simply sat there, the little plastic stick pressed between her fingers, feeling the floor of her life quietly give way beneath her. Dana found her that way 20 minutes later, still sitting on the edge of the tub, and did not ask what was wrong. She simply knelt down on the tile in her work clothes, took Grace's free hand, and waited. "I don't even know his last name," Grace finally whispered. "I don't know where he works. I don't know if the name he told me was real." Her voice cracked on the last word. "I don't know how to find a man who doesn't want to be found." "You don't know that he doesn't want to be found," Dana said gently. "You said he left. You never said he left you." Grace shook her head, unable in that moment to separate the two. The following weeks became a private, exhausting kind of investigation, the sort no one trains you for conducted after work shifts, and before sleep, fueled by a stubborn refusal to let the child she was carrying grow up believing his mother had never even tried. Grace went back to the bar on the narrow street off Bourbon 3 separate times, describing a tall man with an unhurried voice and eyes that had watched her like she mattered, hoping someone, the bartender, the trumpet player, anyone might remember him. The bartender remembered a man who tipped generously and asked for nothing in return, which told her nothing useful at all. The security guard outside recalled a black car that had waited nearby that night, but couldn't say for whom. No one had a name. No one had a number. Whoever he was, he had walked into that bar like a man accustomed to leaving no trail behind him. Though Grace, standing there with her hand pressed unconsciously to her still flat stomach, had no way of understanding why that might be true. She tried the hotel next, describing the room, the floor, the particular gold crest on the notepad she remembered glimpsing on the nightstand before she fell asleep beside him. The young woman at the front desk was kind but unhelpful. Guests' names were confidential, she explained. And besides, dozens of rooms matched that description on any given week. Grace stood in that lobby for a long time after the conversation ended, watching well-dressed guests move past her toward elevators, feeling, for the first time in her life, entirely invisible. Each dead end closed like a door behind her, until there were no more doors left to try. Her mother's decline, which had been slow and quiet for months, accelerated with a cruelty that felt almost designed to test exactly how much one young woman could carry at once. Grace had kept the pregnancy from her as long as she could manage, not wanting to add worry to a body already fighting so hard just to keep going. But there came an evening sitting at the small kitchen table, where Grace had done her homework as a girl, when the truth simply could not stay folded inside her chest any longer. Her mother did not raise her voice. She did not ask the questions Grace had braced herself for: who, when, why. She reached instead across the table with a hand grown thin and pale, and laid it gently over Grace's stomach, still flat beneath her worn sweater. "This child didn't choose how he was made," her mother said, her voice steady despite everything the illness had already taken from her. "And neither did you choose to be left holding the whole weight of it alone. Don't you let shame make your decisions for you, Grace. Shame is a coward. It only shows up when it thinks you won't fight back." Grace held on to those words the way a person holds onto a rope in deep water. 2 months later, in the small hours of an ordinary Tuesday, her mother died in her sleep quietly without pain. The doctors could later confirm, leaving Grace to plan a funeral with almost nothing in her savings account, and a grief so total it seemed to hollow out the very air around her. She sold the few pieces of jewelry her mother had left behind. She closed the small back bedroom where her mother had slept for the last difficult months, unable for a long while to walk past its door without her chest tightening. She learned in the weeks that followed to live inside a silence no amount of music or television noise could ever quite fill. The pregnancy became, in the strange logic of grief, the only reason Grace found to get out of bed some mornings. She would lie awake at night, one hand resting over the small growing swell of her stomach, talking softly into the dark. "I don't know if I'll ever find your father. she told the child once, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I promise you, you will never wonder if you were wanted. Not for one single day." She began calling him Caro. In her mind, before she'd even chosen the name officially, a private word that made the abstract fact of him feel solid, real hers. Dana helped where she could, though. Dana had her own life pulling at her own bills, her own exhaustion. Grace understood without resentment that she could not lean on her friend forever. She needed work, steady work, the kind that would still be there when her body could no longer hide what it was carrying. She found it at a restaurant on the edge of the Garden District, an elegant place with white tablecloths and a wine list, longer than the menu itself, where a manager named Renata Cole looked her over once. Asked only 2 questions: could she stand for long hours, and could she be trusted and hired her? On the spot, when Grace answered yes to both, even as the first question grew harder to answer honestly with each passing week. Grace told herself walking home that first night with an apron folded under her arm that she had finally found solid ground. She did not yet know that solid ground for her would always come with a cost. She only knew that somewhere in this city, a city she now understood to be far larger and far more capable of swallowing a person whole than she had ever imagined, a man she had shared one honest night with was living some entirely different life, unaware that a part of that night was growing inside her, unaware that he had left behind more than an empty room and a scent of unfamiliar cologne. She did not know his name, she did not know his world, but she knew with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic that she would carry this child into whatever came next without once letting him believe, even for a single day, that he had arrived into the world unwanted. In the months that followed Cormac Landry's funeral, Beau found himself doing the kind of work grief rarely allows a person to do, quickly sorting through a dead man's life one drawer at a time, deciding what deserved to be kept and what deserved finally to be let go. The Landry family estate on Britannia Street had always felt too large for one man, even when that man was alive. Now, with Cormac gone, its rooms seemed to hold their silence the way a held breath holds air, waiting for someone to let it out. Beau had put off his father's study longest of all. It was the one room in the house that had always belonged entirely to Cormac. The leather chair worn into the shape of him, the smell of old cedar and pipe tobacco that no amount of time seemed able to lift from the walls. Beau told himself each week he avoided it, that he simply hadn't found the time. The truth, which he admitted to no one, was that he wasn't ready to find in his father's handwriting a version of the man who might have loved him more plainly than Cormac had ever managed while he was alive to say it. He went in on a gray afternoon a week before what would have been the anniversary of his father's death, telling himself it was time that Jonah had been right to gently push him toward it. "You don't have to do it alone, Jonah," Pruitt had said the night before, sitting across from Beau at the kitchen table in the small house he still kept near the old neighborhood. A house Beau had bought him years ago, and Jonah had never quite let himself believe he was allowed to call his brain own. Jonah had known Beau since they were boys, splitting a single sandwich between 2 empty stomachs behind Delacroix's laundromat. And in 30 years, he had never once told Beau a comfortable lie. "But I know you're going to try to." Beau had smiled at that, tired and grateful in equal measure, and gone to the study alone anyway, because some griefs he had learned could only be carried by the person who owned them. The desk held nothing unusual: ledgers, correspondence with restaurant suppliers, the ordinary paper trail of a man who had spent his life building something legitimate on top of something that never quite was. It was the portrait above the fireplace that gave Beau pause, a formal painting of the Landry family commissioned when Beau was 6 years old. His mother seated with her hand resting on his small shoulder, her face rendered by the artist with a softness Beau's own memory had never quite managed to preserve. He had walked past that painting 1,000 times in his life without truly looking at it. That afternoon, for reasons he could not have named, he lifted it from the wall. Behind it, set into the plaster, was a small steel safe he had never known existed. It took him the better part of an hour and a call to a locksmith Cormac's estate attorney reluctantly provided to get it open. Inside there was no cash, no deed, none of the things a man might reasonably expect to find hidden behind a family portrait. There was a stack of letters bound with a rubber cord gone brittle with age, and beneath them a single photograph in a small brass frame, its edges worn soft from handling. Beau's hands went unsteady before his mind had caught up to why. The photograph showed his mother Adeline, whose face he knew only from a handful of childhood photos his father had allowed to remain in the house, spare and formal, none of them warm. But this photograph was different. She was laughing in it, mid-motion, her hair caught by a wind that had blown decades ago in a place Beau did not recognize, wearing a coat he had never seen in his life. On the back, in handwriting that was unmistakably his father's, someone had written a date. Beau read it twice, certain both times that he had misunderstood. The date was nearly 2 years after the date carved into his mother's headstone. He sat down heavily in his father's chair, the letters still bound in his lap, and for a long moment he did not open them because some part of him, the same part that had once learned at 7 years old, to stop asking questions about his mother. Because the asking only ever brought his father's face into a stillness that frightened him more than any answer could have understood. That whatever waited inside those pages would not let him go back to believing the story he had spent 28 years grieving. He opened them anyway. The letters were not addressed to him. They were addressed in his father's hand to someone Cormac called only my love, never a name, as though even on paper he had not trusted the world enough to write it plainly. They spoke of danger Beau did not fully understand, of a decision made for her safety, and the boys of a promise repeated in various forms across at least 6 letters, spanning what appeared to be years, that things would settle, that she could come home, that he had not stopped trying to make it safe for her to return. The final letter in the stack dated less than a year before Cormac's death ended, with a single line that Beau read a dozen times without managing to make it mean anything less devastating than it did. I know I said I would fix this before he was old enough to need you. I am sorry I did not keep that promise. I hope someday he forgives us both. Beau sat very still in the dim light of his father's study, a grown man of considerable wealth and considerable power, undone in the space of an afternoon by the possibility that the woman he had spent his whole life believing dead might in fact have simply been kept from him. He thought of every birthday he had spent watching other boys' mothers arrive with cake and balloons while his own remained a photograph on a mantel. He thought of the particular silence his father used to fall into every year on a date in early spring, a silence Beau had always assumed was grief, and now understood with a cold and creeping horror might have been something closer to guilt. He thought, too, of the boy who had built an entire empire, restaurants, a fortune, a name known across 3 states out of the conviction that people who loved you disappeared, and that the only defense against that disappearing was to never fully let anyone close enough to leave a mark when they went. He thought of Vivienne and the careful, comfortable distance he had always kept even from her. He thought unexpectedly, and with a force that startled him, of a woman in a small bar off Bourbon Street, who had listened to him the way no one had in years, and whom he had let vanish out of his life, without ever telling himself the full truth of how much that loss had cost him. He did not call Jonah that night, though he wanted to. He sat instead in his father's chair, until the light outside the window had gone from gray to black. The letters spread across his knees like evidence in a trial. Only he had been called to attend, turning one impossible question over, and over in the dark. If his mother had not died the way he had always been told, if some version of Adeline Landry was, or had once been, still breathing somewhere in the world, then what exactly had his entire life been built to survive? By the time Grace's belly had grown too large to hide, beneath even the most forgiving apron she had learned to move through a full dinner service, the way a person learns to walk on a broken bone that has never quite been allowed to heal carefully, deliberately, and without letting anyone see how much each step actually cost her. The restaurant sat on a quiet corner of the Garden District, its dining room lit by soft brass sconces, its clientele, the kind of old-money families who ordered the same table every week and tipped exactly what etiquette required, never a cent more. Grace had been grateful for the job from her very first shift. Gratitude, however, did not make her feet hurt any less by the end of a 10-hour night. Nor did it make the small, constant ache in her lower back disappear when she finally sat down on the bus home. Renata Cole watched her closely, those first months in the particular way a woman who has survived her own hard years learns to watch a younger woman heading into hers. Renata never asked more than Grace was willing to give. She simply began without announcement adjusting the schedule so that Grace's shifts ended before the late crowd arrived and quietly moving her to sections with fewer stairs. When Grace tried to thank her for it one evening, Renata only shrugged, wiping down the host stand with brisk, unsentimental efficiency. "I had my own boy," young Renata said, not looking up. "Nobody made it easier for me. Doesn't mean I have to make it harder for you." That kindness, small and unadorned as it was, became one of the few steady things in Grace's life during those months, a kindness she had not asked for and had not expected arriving from a woman who owed her nothing. Every shift without fail, Grace slid a portion of her tips into a metal tin she kept hidden at the back of her closet shelf, a hand-me-down cookie tin with a faded picture of a magnolia on the lid onto which she had stuck a small paper label in her own handwriting, Eli. She had settled on the name somewhere in her 6th month after months of calling him only Caro in the privacy of her own thoughts, a private word between the two of them before he had a name the rest of the world would use. Eli felt right the moment she wrote it, solid and plain, and entirely his own, unattached to anyone who had come before him. Into the tin went crumpled ones and fives. Sometimes a lucky 10 on a good Saturday. Each bill a small physical proof that she was managing, that she had not let the hardest year of her life become an excuse to give up on the child growing inside her. Beside the money, she kept a folded list updated in pencil almost every week, a second-hand crib she'd found through a church bulletin board and paid off in 3 installments, a stack of diapers on sale she'd bought 2 packages at a time, a soft yellow blanket Dana had knitted herself badly with more love in it than skill. Some nights after Grace had finally undressed and lain down her feet, throbbing her back, aching in ways she had not known a body could ache, she would rest her hand over the movement beneath her ribs and talk to him quietly in the dark. "I know this isn't the nursery you deserve," she whispered once, watching a water stain on the ceiling that had been there since she'd moved in. "I know I can't give you everything the fancy families at my tables give their kids, but I promise you, Eli, you are going to know every single day that you are wanted. That's not nothing. That has to count for something." She believed it even on the nights it was hardest to believe anything at all. Dana remained her one constant companion through those months, showing up at odd hours with grocery bags and gossip, and once an entire second-hand dresser. She and her cousin had wrestled up 3 flights of stairs, laughing the whole way, despite the sweat and the swearing. Dana never once made Grace feel like a burden, though. Grace worried quietly that she was becoming one. "You'd do the same for me," Dana told her flatly, the night she caught Grace apologizing for the 3rd time in a single conversation. "Stop keeping score. We're past that." It was Dana who drove Grace to her prenatal appointments on her days off, sitting in cramped waiting rooms flipping through parenting magazines. Neither of them could afford to take seriously offering commentary that made Grace laugh even through her exhaustion. It was Dana who sat with her on the anniversary of her mother's death, saying nothing useful because there was nothing useful to say, simply staying, until the worst of the grief had passed through Grace like weather. Work, grief, and the slow, steady growth of the child she carried became the entire architecture of Grace's days. She thought of the man from the bar less often than she once had, not because the memory had faded, but because she had made a careful, deliberate decision not to let it own any more of her than it already had. She had a son to raise. Whatever that man's reasons had been for disappearing, she told herself they belonged to his own life now, a life she would likely never intersect with again. She was wrong about that, though she would not learn it for several more months. On the nights her feet ached worst, Grace liked to walk the last few blocks home slowly past the small grocery on the corner, with its buzzing sign past the church whose bells rang. The hour a little late, as though even time in this neighborhood moved at its own tired pace. She would pass her hand over her belly and feel him shift beneath her palm, and something in her chest would loosen, despite everything a stubborn, unreasonable hope she could not entirely explain, given how little the world had offered her lately to justify it. She did not know that 8 months earlier, on the other side of the city, a man in a house far larger than any she would ever set foot in was sitting alone in his father's study, with a stack of old letters in his lap, uncovering a grief of his own that would eventually lead him back toward hers. She only knew the tin in her closet was growing heavier by the week, that Renata's kindness had not once wavered, that Dana had never once let her carry the weight of this alone, even when she tried to insist she could. She knew most of all that whatever else this year had taken from her, it had not taken her ability to stand back up. Every shift she finished, every dollar she folded into that tin, every night she talked softly to the child inside her, instead of giving in to despair, was its own small, unglamorous act of defiance, proof that a woman with almost nothing could still build patiently, and without help, something worth having. She had no way of knowing, walking home in the humid dark with her hand curved protectively around her stomach, that the next time she came face to face with the man from the bar, it would not be by searching. It would be by accident across a dining room he happened to own on a night she had not chosen and could not have prepared for, no matter how many months she'd spent bracing herself for a reunion. She had almost stopped believing would ever come. In the kitchen, Grace pressed both palms flat against the stainless steel counter and made herself breathe, counting the way her mother had taught her years ago, in through 4 beats, out through 6, as though grief and shock could be tamed by arithmetic. Around her, the dinner service continued its usual chaos: pans clattering, a line cook calling out an order, the low roar of exhaust fans, but none of it reached her fully. All she could hear over and over was the sound of a name she had not spoken aloud in 8 months, finally leaving someone else's mouth. Beau. She had not even known it was his real name until this moment. For 8 months she had carried a stranger's face and a stranger's laugh, and no way to attach either one to a life she could ever have found. Now she knew his name, and his face was attached to 11 restaurants apparently, and to a woman in a red dress with a diamond large enough to catch the chandelier light from across the room. Renata found her there, one hand braced against the counter, the other resting instinctively beneath her belly. "Sit down a minute," Renata said already, reaching for a stool. "I can't." Grace shook her head, willing her voice steadier than it felt. "If I sit down, I don't think I get back up tonight." "Grace." That man Grace said quietly still, not quite believing the words as she said them, might be the father of my son. Renata's expression did not change the way Grace expected it to. There was no shock in it, only a kind of grim protective focus, the look of a woman calculating exactly how much trouble had just walked into her dining room. "Then you don't have to go back out there tonight. I'll cover the table myself." Grace almost let her. For one long moment the offer felt like the only kind thing left in the world. An easy door out of a conversation she had rehearsed 1,000 different ways in her head, and never once imagined having to survive in real time. But something in her, the same stubborn thread that had carried her through 3 weeks of searching through her mother's funeral, through months of aching feet, and a hidden tin of tip money, refused the easy door. "No," Grace said, straightening. "I've spent 8 months wondering what I'd say to him if I ever got the chance. I'm not going to hide from it now that it's here." Beau, meanwhile, sat across from Vivienne in a silence that had grown heavy enough to feel almost physical. Vivienne had not stopped talking since Grace disappeared toward the kitchen, though Beau could not have repeated a single sentence she'd said. His mind kept circling back to the same impossible math, 8 months the size of the belly beneath that black apron. The particular way Grace had looked at him before she'd forced herself to turn away. "You're not even listening to me," Vivienne said, finally setting down her wineglass with more force than the moment required. "I'm sorry." Beau dragged his attention back to her, though it cost him something to do it. "It's been a strange evening." "It's been a strange evening because you're staring at a waitress like you've seen a ghost." Vivienne's eyes narrowed sharp, and assessing the same expression she wore when reviewing a contract for a clause working against her. "Who is she, Beau?" He was saved from answering by Grace's return. She approached the table with the tray balanced against her hip again, her expression composed in a way that Beau, watching closely, recognized as effort rather than ease. He had seen that same composure on his own face, in enough mirrors over enough years to know exactly what it cost a person to wear it. "Have you decided on your order?" Grace asked, and her voice when it came was steady and professional, and entirely unlike the voice he remembered from a bar off Bourbon Street 8 months earlier, except for the faintest tremor beneath it. What he doubted Vivienne could hear, but he could. "Grace." Her name, spoken aloud in his own voice for the first time in 8 months, felt strange and enormous in his mouth. "I didn't know you worked here. I started a few months ago." She kept her eyes on her notepad, not on him. "Are you ready to order? Or would you like more time?" Vivienne set down her glass again, studying the exchange with open suspicion now. "You two know each other." "We met once," Grace said carefully before Beau could answer. "A long time ago." "It wasn't that long ago," Beau said quietly, and regretted it immediately when Vivienne's gaze swung sharply between the two of them. "How interesting," Vivienne said in a tone that suggested she found it anything but. She looked Grace over slowly, deliberately letting her eyes drop to the unmistakable curve beneath the apron before returning cool and appraising to Grace's face. "I suppose congratulations are in order. When are you due?" The question landed with a precision Beau recognized instantly, not curiosity but a blade disguised as small talk, meant to draw blood in front of an audience too polite to intervene. Soon Grace answered, simply refusing to give the question more than it deserved. "How lovely." Vivienne's smile did not reach her eyes. "It must be difficult being on your feet all night in your condition. I do hope the father's around to help." The silence that followed lasted only a second or two, but to Beau it felt endless, a held breath waiting to see whether the room would collapse under its own weight. He watched something flicker across Grace's face. Not quite anger, not quite grief. Something harder to name that lived in the narrow space between both before she lifted her chin and answered in a voice that did not waver. "I manage," Grace said. "I've had practice." Beau felt the words land somewhere beneath his ribs, precise as a blade of his own. "I've had practice." 8 months of practice, he understood now, at managing exactly the kind of absence he himself had left behind. "I'll give you both another moment," Grace added, and turned to go before either of them could stop her. Though Beau noticed watching her retreat that her hand had found its way back to the curve of her stomach, an unconscious, protective gesture that told him more about the last 8 months of her life than any conversation could have. Vivienne turned back to him the instant Grace was out of earshot. Her voice dropped low and cold. "Beau, what exactly is going on?" He looked past her toward the swinging kitchen door. toward the woman who had just walked away from him for the second time in 8 months. This time carrying something that had changed the shape of both their lives without either of them choosing it. "I don't know yet," Beau said honestly, and for the first time all evening he meant every word of it. "But I intend to find out." Grace made it 3 more tables before the pain found her. It arrived without warning, a tightening low across her stomach that stole the breath clean out of her lungs, sharper than the practice contractions she'd been told to expect in these final weeks. She set the water pitcher down carefully on the nearest table, gripping the edge of it until the wave passed, and told herself the way she had told herself through every hard month of this pregnancy that she could keep going a little longer. She made it exactly 4 more steps before the second wave hit worse than the first, and the sound that came out of her half-gasp, half-cry carried across the dining room loud enough to turn heads. Renata was at her side before Beau had even fully risen from his chair. "Sit down. Now." Renata's voice had dropped the pleasant hospitality-trained register she used with guests, replaced by something flatter and far more urgent. "Someone get water. Cold, not ice." "I'm fine," Grace managed, though the tremor in her voice argued otherwise. "It's early. It's too early. It can't be." Another contraction cut her off entirely, doubling her forward. One hand braced against the back of a chair, the other pressed hard beneath her belly. Beau was moving before he had decided to closing the distance between his table and hers, in a handful of strides, ignoring Vivienne's sharp intake of breath behind him. "Grace." He crouched beside her chair, keeping his voice low, steady, the same voice he might have used once a lifetime ago, calming a frightened child in a cold apartment above a laundromat. "Tell me what you need." "I need this baby to wait 4 more weeks," Grace said, half laughing, half sobbing, the sound of it breaking something open in Beau's chest. "He doesn't listen to me either, apparently." Vivienne's voice cut across the table, cool and precise, even now. "Beau, think about your reputation for a moment. Half the room is watching." He did not turn to look at her. "Someone call an ambulance," he said instead, to no one in particular, to everyone at once. The ambulance, it turned out, was delayed by an accident several blocks away, and each minute of waiting stretched thin and unbearable in the humid dining room, the murmur of concerned guests rising around them like weather. Renata knelt on the floor beside Grace's chair, holding her hand, murmuring instructions about breathing that Grace tried imperfectly to follow. Beau paced a tight circle nearby, phone pressed to his ear, coordinating with his driver, in a voice that had gone flat and businesslike. The voice of a man who had learned across many crises exactly how to sound calm, even when nothing inside him felt calm at all. Vivienne rose from the table at last, smoothing her dress with hands that were not entirely steady either, though her composure held longer than most people's would have. "If you leave with her," she said quietly, close enough that only Beau could hear it, "you understand what that means for us." Beau looked at her for a long moment, really looked the way he had not let himself look at her in longer than he wanted to admit. "I understand what it means if I don't," he said. And then he was moving, helping Grace up from the chair with careful hands, guiding her toward the door, while Renata gathered her things and promised to follow as soon as she'd reached Donna. Across town, in the small back office of Landry Hospitality Group that Jonah Pruitt had claimed for himself years ago, a stack of papers sat spread across the desk under the cold glow of a single lamp. Jonah had not meant to find what he found. He had simply been doing what he always did when something about a person unsettled him, running the numbers, following the paper trail, because numbers, unlike people, rarely bothered to lie convincingly. He had started looking into the Ashford family's finances weeks earlier, quietly, without telling Beau, not because he distrusted Vivienne specifically, but because he had learned 30 years ago in a neighborhood that punished trust, freely given, that it was always safer to know exactly who you were dealing with before you let them close enough to matter. What he found troubled him more than he had expected. The Ashford family fortune, publicly presented as old and stable, had in fact been hemorrhaging money for the better part of a decade. Bad investments, a failed hotel venture in Baton Rouge, mounting debts to creditors who did not typically extend the kind of patience Vivienne's father, Whitman, Ashford, seemed to be receiving. Jonah traced the pattern of that patience back through a maze of shell companies and holding accounts until it led him somewhere that made the hair on the back of his neck rise. The Kovac family. Jonah had heard the name before in the careful, coded way his own line of work required, a rival organization out of Baton Rouge, one that had spent years circling the edges of Landry territory without ever finding a way in. If the Ashford debts were being quietly absorbed by Kovac money, that meant Whitman Ashford owed the Kovac family a debt of his own. And there was only one currency Jonah could think of that a man like Whitman Ashford might use to repay a debt of that size: access. Influence. A daughter married into the one family in New Orleans the Kovacs had never managed to touch. Jonah sat back in his chair, The papers fanned out before him like the pieces of a puzzle he badly wished he had not started assembling, and reached for his phone with a hand that was not entirely steady. Beau did not answer. Jonah tried twice more before a text came through, instead terse and urgent. At the hospital. Grace is in labor. Call you when I can. Jonah stared at the message for a long moment, torn between two truths he could not yet reconcile. A woman in genuine crisis at a hospital across town, and evidence on his desk suggesting the fiancé Beau had spent 3 years planning a life with might be whether she knew it or not. A thread in someone else's far more dangerous design. He gathered the papers carefully into a folder, locked them in the office, safe out of habit more than caution, and sat alone in the small pool of lamplight for a long while, turning over the same question that had followed him since childhood, since 2 boys shared one sandwich behind a laundromat, learned far too young that the people who seemed safest were not always the ones who were. If he was right about Vivienne Ashford, then everything Beau believed he was building his future on was standing on ground that had already begun to give way beneath him, and somewhere in a delivery room across the city, a woman Jonah had spent months quietly distrusting was about to bring a child. Into the middle of all of it, entirely unaware of the danger circling closer with every passing hour. He picked up the phone one more time, though he knew Beau could not answer it yet, and typed a message he would not send until morning because some truths Jonah had learned the hard way should never be delivered over a screen. We need to talk. It's about Vivienne. It's bigger than either of us thought. Vivienne caught up to Beau in the restaurant's entryway, her heels sharp against the marble, her voice pitched low enough to keep the scene from the valet stand, but not low enough to hide its edge. If you walk out that door with her, Vivienne said, you understand there's no coming back from it. Not the wedding. Not us. Whatever this is you think you're doing. Beau turned to face her fully for what felt in that moment like the first time in years. He took in the careful lines of her face, the practiced steadiness she was fighting to hold on to even now, and beneath it something he had never let himself examine too closely before, a kind of hardness that had always been there, dressed up, as sophistication mistaken for strength. Vivienne, he said. And his voice came out quieter than he expected, almost gentle the way a person speaks when they are closing a door. They know they will never open again. A woman is in labor. My son might be on the way. I don't have time to explain why that matters more to me than anything you're asking me to protect right now. Your reputation matters, Vivienne snapped. This family's name matters. Everything your father built. My father, Beau said, cutting her off with a steadiness that surprised even him, spent his whole life protecting the wrong things at the wrong moments. I'm not interested in making the same mistake twice in one night. He did not wait for her answer. He walked out into the warm, wet evening, climbed into the back of the car where Grace sat doubled over another contraction, her hand already reaching for something to hold on to, and let the door close behind him on a version of his life. Understood with sudden and total clarity. He had no intention of returning to. The car moved slowly through downtown traffic, every red light stretching unbearably long. Grace kept her eyes closed between contractions, breathing in careful counted rhythms. One hand pressed white-knuckled against the seat. Beau sat close beside her without touching her, unsure of what comfort he had any right to offer. A woman he had in her eyes disappeared on 8 months ago. You didn't have to leave her like that, Grace said quietly, between waves of pain, her eyes still closed. In front of everyone. I didn't leave her like anything, Beau said. I made a choice. It just happened to be an obvious one. Grace opened her eyes, then studying him in the dim passing light of street lamps, something unreadable moving behind her exhaustion. She didn't answer, and Beau didn't push her to. There would be time, he told himself, for the harder conversations, assuming there was time at all, assuming his son arriving weeks earlier than anyone had planned for gave them that much. His phone buzzed against his thigh. He almost let it go to voicemail until he saw Jonah's name on the screen, and something in his gut told him this was not a call that could wait. Jonah, I can't. I know where you are. Jonah cut in, his voice tight and fast in a way Beau rarely heard from him. I wouldn't call if it could wait. It can't. Beau glanced at Grace, who had turned her face toward the window, giving him what privacy the small space allowed. Go ahead. It's Vivienne's family, Jonah said. I've spent 3 weeks pulling apart her father's finances. Whitman Ashford is drowning in debt, has been for years. Failed hotel deal in Baton Rouge, bad loans, the whole thing. And somebody's been quietly covering for him. Absorbing the debt. Keeping the creditors patient. Who Jonah's answer came after a beat of silence Beau felt in his chest before he heard the words. The Kovac family. Beau went very still. In his world, the quieter, older world his father had built long before Landry Hospitality Group ever existed, the name Kovac carried a specific weight. Baton Rouge, a rival organization that had spent a decade probing the edges of Landry territory. Always testing, never quite finding a door left unlocked. You're telling me Whitman Ashford owes a debt to Kovac, Beau said slowly, and he's been engineering my engagement to his daughter to pay it off. I'm telling you, it's the only explanation that fits every piece I've found, Jonah said. A marriage between you and Vivienne doesn't just clear the Ashford name financially. It gives Kovac a door into Landry Hospitality Group they've never had before. Family ties, business access information nobody outside your inner circle should ever have. I don't know if Vivienne knows what her father's doing. I don't know if she's a willing part of it or just useful to it. But Beau, I think this whole engagement was built to get someone inside your walls. And it almost worked. Beau closed his eyes, the weight of it settling over him slower than he expected, the way true betrayal often does, not as a single blow but as a series of smaller realizations arriving one after another, each one reframing something he had believed was solid. 3 years of a relationship he had told himself was safe precisely because it asks so little of him emotionally. 3 years of choosing comfort and convenience over the harder, riskier work of actually being known by someone. He thought with a bitterness he didn't try to soften that he had let himself be so easily managed because managed was in some broken way familiar to him. Does she know I'm on my way to the hospital right now? Beau asked. Does Kovac know? I don't know yet, Jonah admitted. But if there's any truth to this, and Grace and the baby become part of your life in a way that threatens what Ashford and Kovac were trying to build, I need you to understand that puts them both at risk too. Not just embarrassment. Real risk. Grace's hand found Beau's arm, suddenly her grip tightening through another contraction, and whatever cold, calculating part of him that had spent years running an empire, both legitimate and otherwise, rose instinctively to the surface, steadying itself around the two people beside him who mattered more in this moment than any name or any threat. Send me everything you have the second I'm out of this hospital, Beau said quietly. And Jonah, thank you. For not sitting on this. For telling me even when you knew what it would cost me to hear it. You're my oldest friend, Jonah said simply. I'd rather you be angry at the truth than comfortable with a lie. Beau ended the call and slid the phone back into his pocket, watching the hospital's lit entrance finally come into view through the windshield. Beside him, Grace let out a low, exhausted sound of relief at the sight of it, her hand still gripping his arm as though she had forgotten for the moment that she had any reason not to trust him with her weight. He looked down at her at the fear and the strength moving across her face in equal measure, and understood with a clarity that startled him that whatever danger Jonah's discovery had just revealed, he would spend every resource he had, the restaurants, the money, the quieter, and more dangerous inheritance his father had left him to keep it as far from this woman and this child as his hands could possibly reach. The car pulled to a stop. Beau was already moving before the driver had fully opened the door, ready for the first time in longer than he could remember, to choose the harder and more honest path simply because it was the right one. The delivery room moved too fast for Beau to fully understand a blur of scrubs and monitors and voices calling numbers back and forth in a language of urgency he recognized without comprehending. He had been allowed only as far as the hallway once the medical team decided Grace's labor had progressed beyond anything gentle. And he stood there now in his rumpled dinner jacket, feeling for the first time in decades entirely helplessly useless. 28 minutes. That was how long it took, though. Beau would later swear it felt closer to a lifetime before a nurse pushed through the double doors, carrying something so small. It barely seemed possible that it had ever fit inside another person. He's here, the nurse said, her voice carefully neutral, in the way medical professionals learn to keep their voices when the outcome is not yet certain. He's small. Very small. We need to get him to the NICU right away. Beau caught only a glimpse. A wrinkled, impossibly small face. A shock of dark hair skin, with a faint bluish cast, that made something in his chest seize with a fear more total than anything he had felt in his adult life before the team swept past him down the corridor. Machines trailing behind on wheeled carts, and he was left standing alone outside a room that had, in the space of half an hour, entirely rearranged the architecture of his future. Mr. Landry. Another nurse touched his arm gently. You can see her now. She's asking for you. Grace lay pale against the hospital, pillows her exhaustion so complete, it seemed to have hollowed something out of her face. But her eyes found Beau the instant he entered, and held on with a desperate, searching intensity. Where's Eli? Her voice cracked on the name. They took him so fast, nobody's telling me anything. He's in the NICU. Beau crossed to her bedside, taking her hand carefully as though it might break, though it was his own hands that were trembling. He's small. They're watching him closely. That's all I know right now. He's too early. Tears slid sideways across Grace's temple into the pillow. 4 weeks too early. This is my fault. I worked too many shifts. I should have stopped sooner. This is not your fault. Beau's voice came out rougher than he intended, fierce, in a way that startled them both. You carried him through 8 months of everything the world threw at you. You did not do this to him. If anyone failed him before tonight, it was me. Grace looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her exhaustion, and did not argue the point, though Beau suspected that was only because she had no strength left to spend on an argument neither of them could win. Tonight, Dana arrived within the hour, breathless and wild-eyed, having driven faster than the city's speed limits generally allowed, and Beau retreated to the hallway to give the two women what privacy the small room permitted. He paced the corridor for a long while afterward, phone pressed to his ear, coordinating quietly with Jonah about security measures. Beau had not until tonight imagined he would ever need for a woman he'd known only a handful of days. I want someone watching every entrance to this hospital, Beau said low enough that passing staff wouldn't overhear. Discreetly. I don't want Grace frightened by it, but I want it done. Already moving on it, Jonah said. I've got 2 of our people rotating through the lobby by midnight. Beau, I know tonight's already too much. But you should know something. What? There's a woman, Jonah said carefully. Older. Been sitting in the family waiting area near the NICU for almost 2 hours. Wide-brimmed hat kept her face down whenever staff walked past. One of our guys clocked her because she seemed to be watching your hallway specifically, not just sitting there like a normal visitor. She left the second he approached. Something cold moved through Beau's chest, unrelated to the fear he already carried for his son. Could be nothing. Family of another patient. Could be, Jonah agreed, though his tone suggested he did not fully believe it. I'll have someone keep an eye out in case she comes back. Beau ended the call and stood alone for a moment in the fluorescent hush of the corridor, turning the detail over uneasily before setting it aside. There was only so much fear a single night could hold, and most of his was already spoken for. He was allowed to see Eli through the nursery glass sometime near midnight, gowned and masked, standing beside a nurse, who explained gently the tangle of wires and tubes surrounding his son's fragile body. A feeding line, a monitor taped against one impossibly small foot, a soft cap to keep his liffins. Head warm, a breathing mask that seemed to Beau's untrained eye entirely too large for a face that small. His lungs aren't fully developed, the nurse explained. That's normal at this gestational age. We're supporting his breathing until he's strong enough to manage more on his own. It's a waiting game from here, Mr. Landry. A hard one, but a survivable one in most cases like his. Most cases. The words lodged themselves somewhere behind Beau's ribs and stayed there. He stood at that glass for a long time, watching the small, fierce rise and fall of his son's chest, and felt something inside him crack open that he had spent 28 years keeping carefully sealed. He thought of the letters in his father's safe of a mother he might have lost to something other than death, of a lifetime spent believing that love, however real, eventually left. He thought of Vivienne and the comfortable guarded distance he had mistaken for safety. He thought of Grace, exhausted and frightened 2 floors below, who had spent 8 months proving without any help from him that some people did not leave. That some people simply stayed and did the hard, unglamorous work of loving something fragile until it grew strong enough to survive. I don't know if you can hear me, Beau said quietly, his palm pressed flat against the glass close enough to his son's small, warmed bassinet that the nurse politely pretended not to notice him speaking. But I want you to know something, Eli. Whatever it costs me, whatever I have to give up, whatever I have to become to keep you safe, I am not going anywhere. Not tonight. Not ever. Behind him, unnoticed in the shadow of the far hallway, a figure in a wide-brimmed hat lingered a moment longer at the edge of the nursery corridor, before turning quietly and slipping away into the hospital's late-night quiet, leaving behind no trace, except the faint lingering scent of an old, familiar perfume that Beau, absorbed entirely in his son's small heartbeat, did not notice at all. Vivienne came to the hospital 2 days later, dressed with the same careful precision she brought to every room she entered, as though even a crisis required proper presentation. She found Grace alone in her recovery room, Dana having stepped out for coffee, Beau downstairs in a meeting with the hospital's neonatal team that had already stretched twice as long as scheduled. I won't take much of your time, Vivienne said, setting her bag on the chair by the window without waiting to be invited to sit. I think we both know why I'm here. Grace, still pale and moving carefully in the aftermath of the delivery, studied her visitor with a wariness that had grown considerably sharper over the last 8 months. I don't have much time either. My son is 2 floors down, fighting to breathe on his own. I'm aware. Something flickered across Vivienne's face. Not quite sympathy, but something adjacent to it, quickly folded away again. Which is exactly why I think we can be reasonable with each other. I don't have anything against your child, Grace. I want you to understand that first. You said congratulations to me over a dinner table like it was an insult, Grace said flatly. Forgive me if I don't believe you. Vivienne's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed level businesslike, the voice of a woman accustomed to negotiating things that mattered far more to her than pride. Beau can provide for your son. Medical care, education, whatever he needs for the rest of his life. In exchange, I'm asking for something simple. Discretion. No press. No public claim on the Landry name. You raise your son quietly, Beau visits when it's convenient and private, and this engagement proceeds as planned. You're asking me to let him grow up hidden, Grace said slowly, so you can keep planning your wedding without an inconvenient complication. I'm asking you to be practical. Vivienne's composure slipped for the first time, a thin crack of real frustration showing through. Do you have any idea what it costs to build the kind of life Beau and I have built? What happens to families like his, businesses like his? The moment scandal touches them, I am trying to protect something larger than either of us. Grace held her gaze for a long, steady moment, feeling something in her chest settle into a clarity she had not expected to find so easily. You're not protecting anything larger than yourself, she said quietly, and I won't build my son's life around hiding him to make yours easier. He's not a complication, Miss Ashford. He's my son. If that's inconvenient for your wedding plans, I'm sorry. I'm not sorry for him existing. Vivienne left without another word, her heels sharp against the tile floor, and Grace sat alone afterward for a long time, her hand resting protectively over the place where Eli had grown for 8 months, feeling for the first time since delivery something closer to strength than exhaustion. Beau learned of the visit from Dana that evening, and something in him went cold and quiet in a way. Jonah, watching from across the small waiting room, recognized as considerably more dangerous than open anger. She went to the hospital, Beau repeated mostly to himself. While Eli's in the NICU, she went to negotiate. Grace handled it, Dana said. Better than I would have, honestly. But you should know. Beau found Dominic Fontaine that same night back at the estate on Prytania Street, in the quiet study that had for 30 years served as the family's true seat of power, regardless of which room the public believed decisions were made. Dominic looked up from his desk with the mild, unhurried expression he had worn Beau's entire life, a man who had built a career on appearing to control every room he entered. I want to talk about a note, Beau said without preamble. 8 months ago. A hotel room. A housekeeper who cleared it away an hour before she should have. Something shifted behind Dominic's eyes, subtle but unmistakable. I don't know what you're referring to. Don't. Beau's voice stayed level, but it carried a weight that filled the room. I've had 8 months to think about how convenient it was that a note with my personal phone number disappeared the same morning I needed to disappear quietly and focus entirely on this family's business. I want to know if that was your work. The silence stretched long enough that Beau understood the answer before Dominic finally spoke. It was, Dominic said, setting down his pen with careful precision. You just inherited everything, Beau. Your father barely cold in the ground, the business exposed on every side, and you were about to let some woman from a bar become a distraction at the exact moment you couldn't afford one. I made a call to the hotel. I asked them to be thorough with the cleaning that morning. I didn't know she'd end up pregnant. I didn't know any of what would come after. I thought I was protecting you. You didn't protect me. Beau's voice had gone quiet in a way that frightened people who knew him well, and Dominic, who had known him his entire life, visibly understood the danger of it. You cost my son 8 months of a father who would have come running the moment he knew. You cost Grace a pregnancy she carried entirely alone. You made a decision about my life that wasn't yours to make. I've made a lot of decisions about this family that weren't strictly mine to make, Dominic said. And something in his tone shifted weary in a way Beau had never heard from him before. It's the job, Beau. Somebody has to decide what gets buried and what gets protected. You tell yourself it's for the family. Eventually, you stop being sure whose family you're protecting anymore. Beau went very still. What is that supposed to mean? Dominic held his gaze for a long moment, and something old and tired moved behind his expression. The look Beau realized slowly of a man carrying more than one buried secret, deciding in real time how many of them he was willing to let go of, in a single night. You think this is the first time I've had to make something disappear to keep this family standing, Dominic said, finally, his voice dropping lower, careful even now. Ask your father sometime why the anniversary in early spring always went so quiet in this house. Ask him what really happened to your mother. The room seemed to tilt slightly around Beau, the letters from the safe rising unbidden in his memory. The photograph dated impossibly after a death he had grieved his entire life. The unfinished promises written in his father's careful hand. My father's dead, Beau said, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't ask him anything. No, Dominic agreed, quietly looking away toward the window, toward the dark garden beyond it, unwilling even now to say the rest of what he clearly knew. But you're not the only one still standing who remembers what happened to her, Beau. You might want to think harder about who else in this city has been watching you a great deal more closely than you've noticed. Beau stood frozen in the doorway of his father's study, the weight of Dominic's words settling over him with a slow, creeping dread that had nothing to do with weddings or hostile takeovers or debts owed to rival families, and everything to do with a wide-brimmed hat glimpsed briefly. Outside a hospital nursery and a scent of perfume, he had been too exhausted that night to notice he recognized. Jonah found her before Beau did. It took 3 days of careful patient work, hospital security footage pulled through a contact who owed Jonah a favor from another lifetime, a partial license plate traced to a rental agency near the airport, a name on the rental agreement that meant nothing to the clerk who processed it, and everything to the man who finally sat staring at it on his laptop screen at 2 a.m. A. Marchetti. Jonah had stared at those 2 words for a long time before he understood why his chest had gone tight around them. Marchetti had been his own grandmother's maiden name, a small, unremarkable coincidence, except that Jonah had grown up close enough to the Landry family to remember faintly a story Cormac had once let slip in an unguarded moment decades ago, that Adeline, before she became a Landry, had been born a Marchetti, the daughter of an old Sicilian family from the 9th Ward. He drove to Beau's house himself rather than call. Some news he had learned long ago deserved to be delivered face to face. Beau read the printout twice, standing in his kitchen at 3 a.m, his hand pressed flat against the counter for balance. This could be nothing, he said, though his voice carried none of the conviction the words were meant to hold. A relative. A coincidence. My mother had cousins I never met. Beau. Jonah's voice was gentle, but unyielding, the voice of a man who had spent 30 years refusing to let his best friend hide from things that mattered. The car was rented the same week Grace went into labor. It's been parked twice outside this house since your father's funeral, according to a neighbor's doorbell camera I convinced to share footage. Whoever she isn't a stranger passing through. She's been watching you for months, maybe longer. Beau closed his eyes. He thought of the safe behind the portrait, the letters bound in brittle cord, a photograph, dated 2 impossible years past a headstone. He had visited every spring of his adult life, kneeling in the grass beside flowers he brought for a woman. He now understood with a dread that made his knees unsteady. He might have been grieving unnecessarily his entire life. I need to find her, Beau said. Tonight. Now. They found the rental car parked 3 blocks from the hospital, in the same quiet residential stretch of the Garden District, where Jonah's earlier surveillance had placed it before. Beau approached the modest guest house alone, waving off the 2 men Jonah had insisted accompany him at a distance, needing whatever waited behind that door to face it without an audience. He knocked. For a long moment, nothing happened long enough that Beau began to wonder if he had chased a coincidence into the middle of the night for nothing. Then the door opened slowly, and the woman on the other side lifted her face from beneath the same wide-brimmed hat Jonah had described from the hospital corridor. Beau's entire body went cold, and then impossibly warm in the same instant. She was older than the woman in the portrait above his father's fireplace, her dark hair threaded through with gray. She had not troubled to hide lines around her eyes that had not existed in any photograph Beau had ever been shown. But the eyes themselves, the particular warm brown he had searched for without knowing it, in every woman he had ever let himself grow close to, were unmistakably, impossibly his own. Beau. Her voice broke on his name, decades of longing compressed into a single syllable. You've grown into your father's shoulders and my mother's stubborn chin. I'd have known you anywhere. You're supposed to be dead. The words came out of him raw and unguarded, the voice of the 7-year-old boy who had stood in a churchyard, holding his father's hand, staring at a headstone he had never fully understood. I have a grave I've visited every spring for 28 years. I brought you flowers, Mom. I told you things. I sat there and talked to a stone because I thought that was the only version of you I was ever going to get. Adeline's composure, carefully held through the opening of the door, finally cracked entirely. I know, she said, tears sliding freely down a face she no longer tried to hide from him. I know, and there is no version of the next hour that undoes a single minute of what that cost you. Can I explain it to you, please, Beau? 28 years. Let me at least try to explain it. He did not move from the doorway. He did not trust himself yet to move closer. But he did not close the door either. And Adeline, reading the smallest permission in that stillness, began to speak. Your father and I built a good life on top of something ugly, she said quietly. You know that already better than I ever wanted you to have to know it. When you were 7, I found out about a debt your grandfather had left behind, a debt to people inside the organization who believed I was a threat to how things were run because I'd started asking your father to walk away from all of it for your sake. I was going to take you and leave. I told your father as much, and within a week, there were threats made against both of us that were specific enough and credible enough that your father made a decision he never forgave himself for. He let you disappear, Beau said, his voice hollow. He staged something worse than disappearing, Adeline said. He staged my death because a woman who'd run could still be found and used against him. A woman who was dead couldn't be leverage against anyone. He promised it would be temporary, 6 months, a year, until the threat against us settled. He promised I'd come home to you the moment it was safe. Her voice broke again. It was never safe, Beau. Not for years. And by the time it might have been, I'd convinced myself you were better off believing I was gone than living with the truth that I'd chosen over and over not to risk coming back. That wasn't your choice to make either. Beau's voice shook now, anger and grief tangled together too tightly to separate. You let me grow up thinking I wasn't enough to fight for. Do you understand what that did to me? I built walls around every single person I ever let close because some part of me has believed since I was 7 years old that the people who love you disappear the moment loving you gets complicated. I know, Adeline whispered. I've watched you build those walls from a distance for years, Beau, and every single time it broke my heart a little more because I knew I was the reason you built the first one. She stepped forward close enough now that Beau could see clearly the particular way her hands trembled. The same tremor he recognized in his own hands during moments of unbearable feeling. But I am done watching from a distance. When I heard what happened to your son, when I heard there might be danger circling that child the way it once circled you, I couldn't stay hidden one more night. Not for anyone's safety. Not even my own. Beau stood in the doorway for a long, unmeasured moment, 28 years of grief, and a lifetime of careful distance colliding inside him with a force that nearly buckled his knees. Then, slowly, he closed the space between them and let his mother fold her arms around him, the way she had not been permitted to since he was 7 years old, both of them shaking, both of them finally, after nearly 3 decades, allowing themselves to grieve the years they had lost together instead of alone. I'm not going anywhere again, Adeline whispered against his shoulder. Not while there's breath left in me. I've already missed too much. Behind them, the wide-brimmed hat lay forgotten on the guest-house floor, and for the first time in 28 years, Beau Landry stood in his mother's arms without a single wall left standing between them. The envelope sat unopened on the small table in the hospital's family consultation room for nearly a full minute before anyone reached for it, as though the paper inside carried a weight none of them were quite ready to lift. Grace sat in the wheelchair. The nurses still insisted on for these short trips down the hall. Eli's tiny knit cap visible through the nursery window behind them, his breathing steadier now than it had been in the first frightening days, though still monitored around the clock. Beau stood beside her. Adeline sat a little apart, hands folded tightly in her lap, present at Grace's own invitation offered the night before in a quiet hospital hallway, with a simplicity that had moved Beau more than he expected. You're his grandmother, Grace had said. Whatever happens with the paper, that part isn't going to change. I'd like you here. Now, watching the envelope, Adeline reached over and covered Beau's hand with her own, the first small, ordinary gesture of comfort she had offered him since childhood, and one that steadied something in his chest more than he let himself. Show. Do you want to open it? Beau asked Grace gently. She shook her head, her hands trembling too much to trust with something this important. You do it. I already know what I believe. I just need to hear you say it out loud. Beau opened the envelope carefully, unfolded the single page inside, and read the results in silence for a moment, longer than necessary, not because the language was complicated, but because some part of him needed an extra breath before he let the truth become official. Eli is my son, he said finally, his voice breaking slightly around the words. 99.99% probability. There's no more question left to ask. Grace closed her eyes, tears sliding freely down her face, relief and vindication, and 8 months of exhausting uncertainty finally allowed to leave her all at once. Adeline's hand tightened around Beau's, and when he looked at her, he found her crying too quietly. The particular tears of a woman who had just watched her own history threaten to repeat itself. And this time come out differently. Being his father on paper is the easy part, Grace said once she'd found her voice again. The real test starts when he comes home. The sleepless nights, the fevers, the choices that aren't convenient for anyone's schedule. I know, Beau said. I intend to be there for every one of them. He called Vivienne that same afternoon, standing alone in the hospital courtyard beneath a sky heavy with the promise of rain, and ended their engagement in a conversation that lasted less than 5 minutes and left neither of them any illusions about what remained to be said. "You're choosing a waitress and a baby you didn't even know existed a month ago," Vivienne said, her voice flat with disbelief. "Over 3 years and everything we built." "I'm choosing honesty over an arrangement. I only recently understood the true shape of Beau," said quietly. "I know about your father's debt, Vivienne. I know about Kovac. I don't know how much of it you were ever part of, and some part of me hopes it's less than I fear. But I can't build a marriage on ground I now know was never solid to begin with." The silence on the other end of the line told him everything he needed to know about how much of the truth had in fact reached her already. "Be careful," Beau, Vivienne said finally, her voice quieter, now stripped of its usual polish. "My father doesn't lose gracefully. Neither do the people he owes." She ended the call before he could answer, and Beau stood alone in the courtyard for a long moment, the warning settling over him with a weight he understood he could not afford to ignore. Dominic Fontaine was gone from the estate by the time Beau returned that evening. His office cleared his resignation letter left on the desk where the safe's discovery had first cracked open. Everything Beau thought he understood about his own family. The letter offered no apology, only a single line that Beau read twice before folding it away. "Everything I did believing it protected this family. I understand now that protection built on secrets isn't protection at all. I'm sorry it took losing your trust to teach me that." Beau did not know yet what to do with 30 years of loyalty tangled up with 30 years of quiet betrayal. He set the letter aside and did not chase Dominic down that night, telling himself there would be time later to decide what accountability looked like for a man who had in his own broken way tried to serve a family. He'd also repeatedly failed. Jonah found him there an hour later, standing in the empty office, and did not need to ask what had happened. "I should have caught what Dominic was doing years ago," Jonah said quietly. "I had access to half the same records he did." "You caught what mattered when it mattered," Beau said. "You found the Ashford connection before it cost me everything. You found my mother before I lost the chance to know her again. I don't know how to thank you for either of those things properly, so I'm not going to try tonight. I'm just going to say it plainly. I don't know what the last 30 years would have looked like without you in them, Jonah, and I don't ever want to find out." Jonah, never entirely comfortable with sentiment, managed only a rough nod and a hand briefly on Beau's shoulder, though something in his expression, steadier, warmer than the careful wariness he'd carried for months, told Beau the words had landed exactly where they were meant to. "There's still Whitman Ashford to deal with," Jonah said after a moment, his voice returning to its usual careful practicality. "And whatever's owed to Kovac doesn't just disappear because you called off a wedding. If anything, ending the engagement just took away their easiest way in. People like that don't usually walk away quietly when their easiest option closes." Beau looked toward the window, toward the dark garden, where 2 nights earlier his mother had stepped back into his life, after 28 years of careful, painful distance. He thought of Eli still small, and fighting in a hospital bassinet 2 miles away. He thought of Grace, exhausted but unbroken, who had built an entire tin full of hard-earned dollars and an entire son's worth of love, without waiting for anyone's permission to do it. "Then we make sure they understand exactly how much harder the difficult way just became," Beau said quietly, and for the first time since his father's funeral, he felt the full, steady weight of everything he had inherited: the restaurants, the fortune, and the quieter, older responsibility his family had always carried in the shadows settle onto his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a purpose. He finally understood how to use for something worth protecting. The warning came 3 days after Beau ended, his engagement delivered not as a threat spoken aloud, but as something quieter and in its own way more frightening. A black sedan parked for 2 consecutive mornings across the street from Grace's apartment on Dauphine Street, its windows tinted, its engine idling just long enough to be noticed and gone before anyone could approach it. Jonah had eyes on it both times. By the second morning, Beau had already moved Grace, Dana, and the still fragile Eli into a guarded wing of the Britannia Street estate over Grace's initial and considerable protest. "I am not some fragile thing that needs locking away," Grace had said, standing in the estate's grand foyer with Eli asleep against her shoulder, exhaustion and stubbornness fighting for control of her voice in equal measure. "You're not fragile," Beau had agreed, "but my son is 3 weeks old and still on a heart monitor half the day. And I am not willing to find out what a car like that is capable of before I've done everything in my power to make sure it never gets the chance." Grace had not argued further after that. Some battles she was learning were not worth winning if winning cost more than either of them could afford to lose. Adeline proved in those tense days to be an asset neither Beau nor Jonah had fully anticipated. 28 years removed from the organization's daily operations, She nonetheless carried a working knowledge of its oldest structures, its oldest rivalries, its oldest debts. Knowledge that predated even Jonah's careful bookkeeping. The Kovac family doesn't want a war, Adeline explained one evening, seated at the long table in the estate's private study. A map of old territorial agreements spread before her that Beau hadn't known existed until she produced it from memory rather than paper. Wars are expensive and they draw attention neither family wants. What they want is exactly what the marriage would have given them: quiet access away inside without ever having to knock down a door. Whitman Ashford's debt was their leverage. Now that leverage is gone, and men like that don't usually risk violence over a plan that's already failed. They regroup. They look for the next opening. So, we don't give them one, Jonah said. You give them something better, Adeline said. You give them a reason to believe pursuing this any further costs them more than walking away does. The meeting was arranged through channels Beau had inherited but rarely used himself, a private room above a jazz club on Frenchman Street, chosen deliberately for its neutral ground, its owner having owed the Landry family a debt of loyalty, going back 2 generations. Beau arrived with Jonah at his side, and to Jonah's visible unease, Adeline as well, who had insisted with a quiet steel. Beau was only beginning to understand she possessed that she be present. They knew me once, Adeline said simply when Beau tried gently to talk her out of it. Let them see that the woman they thought they'd erased is still very much capable of sitting across a table from them. Vittorio Kovac arrived precisely on time, an older man with careful manners and eyes that missed nothing, flanked by 2 associates who said nothing throughout the entire meeting. Whitman Ashford was notably absent, a detail Beau understood immediately was not an accident. Mr. Landry. Kovac inclined his head with old-world courtesy that did nothing to soften the calculation behind it. And Mrs. Landry, if I'm not mistaken? It's been a long time. It has, Adeline said evenly. Long enough that I hoped your family had found better uses for its patience than debts owed by desperate men trying to marry their way into someone else's house. Kovac's mouth twitched, something almost like respect flickering behind his composure. Whitman Ashford came to us. We simply recognized an opportunity when one presented itself. Nothing personal, you understand. Business rarely is. Then let's discuss business, Beau said, sliding a folder across the table. Documentation. Jonah had spent the last 3 days assembling evidence of the Ashford debt, the shell companies, the quiet financial trail connecting Whitman, Ashford's failing fortune to Kovac, money evidence that, properly distributed, would cause considerably more damage to the Kovac family's careful public reputation than any single failed engagement ever could. This stays exactly where it is, Beau continued, as long as nothing more happens near my son, my fiancé, or anyone under my protection. No cars outside her apartment. No more quiet tests of how far you're willing to push before I push back. The moment I see one more sign of interest in my family, this folder finds its way to every regulator and journalist who's ever wanted a reason to look harder at Baton Rouge. Kovac studied the folder for a long moment without opening it, his expression unreadable. You understand this isn't how these conversations usually end, Mr. Landry. Usually there's more at stake than an exchange of paperwork. Usually, Beau agreed, the people sitting across this table haven't already decided what they're willing to lose to protect what matters to them. I buried my father recently, Mr. Kovac. I found my mother again after 28 years I didn't know I'd been cheated out of. I have a son who spent his first 3 weeks of life fighting to breathe on his own. I have very little patience left for men who think a folder full of leverage is a bluff. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Jonah's hand drifted almost imperceptibly toward his jacket, though nothing in the room's careful stillness suggested it would be needed. Finally, Kovac closed the folder without opening it, sliding it back across the table with a small, resigned exhale. Whitman Ashford's debt was never truly to my family in the first place, Kovac said. It was a courtesy extended to a desperate man who mistook opportunity for friendship. Consider the courtesy withdrawn. Your family will hear nothing further from mine, Mr. Landry, provided you extend us the same courtesy in return. Agreed, Beau said. Kovac rose, buttoning his jacket with unhurried precision, and paused at the door long enough to look back once more, his eyes settling briefly thoughtfully on Adeline. It really has been a long time, Mrs. Landry. I'm glad to see the years were kinder to you than I once assumed they'd be. They were not kind, Adeline said quietly, but they were survivable. There's a difference, and I intend to spend whatever years I have left teaching my son the value of it. Whitman Ashford's collapse, when it came weeks later, arrived through channels far more ordinary than anything Beau had orchestrated. Directly creditors, who no longer had Kovac patience to shield them, a business community that had begun, quietly, to distance itself from a name suddenly synonymous with failed judgment. Vivienne disappeared from New Orleans society altogether within the month. And Beau, watching the news of her family's unraveling from a careful distance, felt none of the satisfaction he might once have expected. Only a tired, complicated relief that the danger circling his son had finally truly passed. He returned home that evening to find Grace on the estate's back porch, Eli asleep in her arms for the first time, without the tangle of hospital wires that had marked nearly every day of his young life so far, and Adeline seated beside them, both humming something low and unfamiliar, that Beau recognized with a sudden ache as a lullaby he must have heard as an infant, and never consciously remembered until this exact moment. He stood in the doorway for a long time, unwilling to disturb the quiet, simply watching 3 generations of a family he had once believed was broken beyond repair sit together in the fading evening light, finally entirely safe. Months pass the way seasons pass, in a city that never fully cools slowly, then all at once. Eli grew stronger with each visit to the pediatrician, his cheeks filling out his cry, growing louder and more insistent by the week, until the fragile boy, who had once fit entirely along the length of Beau's forearm, became almost overnight, it seemed, a baby who could grip a finger with startling determination and hold on, as though he had decided quite firmly never to let go of the people who loved him. Beau spent that season dismantling piece by careful piece the darker inheritance his father had left behind. He met with Jonah and Adeline late into many nights, working through decades of quiet obligations, old debts, and older arrangements, converting what could be converted into something legitimate and letting the rest close permanently behind them. It was slower work than either of them expected, and harder in ways that had nothing to do with paperwork. Old loyalties did not dissolve simply because a man decided he no longer wished to carry them. But Beau had a son now who deserved to inherit an empire built entirely of daylight, and that certainty carried him through every difficult conversation the transition required. The resources that remained once the old obligations were finally settled went towards something Beau and Adeline built together quietly, without either of their names carved anywhere prominent on the building itself. A neonatal care unit at the same hospital where Eli had spent his first fragile weeks, fully funded, fully staffed, available to any family in the city regardless of what they could afford to pay. They named it Adeline's Light, not for the vanity of the name Adeline insisted, but because the two of them understood better than most what it meant for a family to be given back time they had once feared they'd lost for good. Families like Grace's shouldn't have to save tip money in a coffee tin, Adeline said the day the unit officially opened, just to give their child a fighting chance. Grace, standing beside her with Eli balanced on her hip, reached over and squeezed her hand without needing to say anything more. The proposal, when it finally came, arrived without ceremony or spectacle in the small kitchen of the modest house Beau and Grace had chosen together over anything grander the Landry name might have afforded them, a house with a yard just large enough for Eli to eventually learn to walk in close. Enough to Renata's restaurant that Grace could still stop by on her days off just to say hello. The evening had not gone according to plan. Beau had nearly burned the dinner he'd insisted on cooking himself, and Eli had managed somewhere between the salad and the main course to overturn an entire cup of juice across the kitchen floor, sending both adults into a fit of laughter neither of them had expected the evening to hold. It was in the middle of mopping up the mess, Grace still laughing, a dish towel in her hand, that Beau knelt down on the damp kitchen tile and opened the small box he had been carrying unopened for the better part of a year. "I'm not doing this to fix anything," Beau said. "I'm doing this because I want to keep writing the rest of this story with you. Both of you." He glanced toward Eli, who had lost interest in the juice entirely, and was now attempting with great seriousness to eat a spoon. "I love you, Grace. Not because you gave me a son, though I will be grateful for that every single day of my life. I love you because you taught me that people can stay. That love doesn't have to disappear the moment it costs something." Grace knelt down beside him on the kitchen floor, juice and all, and said yes before he had even finished asking. Their wedding, when it came that following spring, was small and unhurried, held in the same modest backyard where Eli had recently taken his first wobbling steps. Dana stood beside Grace. Jonah stood beside Beau, steadier and warmer than the guarded, watchful man who had once quietly investigated Grace's every move. Now entirely certain there had never been anything to find but a woman who deserved every good thing coming to her. Renata cried through the entire ceremony and denied it fiercely afterward. Adeline sat in the front row, her hand pressed to her chest, watching her son build in front of her, the very thing she had once believed her own absence had made impossible for him. Years later, when Eli was old enough to ask questions, Grace and Beau told him a simple, honest version of their story, that they had met once, lost each other by accident, and found their way back through a night neither of them had planned. For they never let him believe for even a single day that his early arrival into the world had been anything other than one had fought for and deeply loved. Your mother worked harder than anyone I've ever known to make sure you had everything you needed, Beau told him once, long before I even knew you existed. And your father, Grace, would add, watching Beau across the room with the same warmth she'd carried since a night in a small bar off Bourbon Street. Learned that being brave sometimes just means choosing to stay, even when staying is harder than walking away. That, in the end, was the truth this story asks each of us to sit with. Money can buy comfort. It can buy safety, education, even second chances. But it cannot buy trust, and it cannot manufacture love strong enough to heal a wound decades old. That kind of healing only comes from presence repeated patiently day after ordinary day, long after the drama has faded, and only the quiet, steady choosing remains. Grace showed us that a person can be poor in circumstance and still be rich in dignity, that asking for help is not the same as losing your worth, and that shame should never be allowed to make our decisions for us. Beau showed us that even a man surrounded by wealth and power can carry an old hidden wound, and that the bravest thing he can do is finally let someone gentle enough close to it to help it heal. And Adeline showed us that it is never too late to come home, even after decades of distance, if love is patient enough to wait for the right moment to step back into the light. If you found even one piece of yourself in this story tonight, we would love to hear it. What lesson did you take away from Beau and Grace's journey? Tell us in the comments below this video. We read every single one, and your stories help this community grow stronger together. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it today, leave a comment telling us your thoughts, and subscribe so you never miss the next story. Thank you so much for watching until the very end. Take care of yourselves, be gentle with the people around you, and we will see you again in the next video.